Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we step back into a world long past. A world where the flickering glow of candlelight softened the heavy timbered walls, where the crackling of a hearth fire was the center of the household, and where every meal, simple or grand, was tied to the rhythms of land, season, and tradition. In this gentle journey, we will explore what people truly ate in the medieval world. Allow the pace of history to slow your own breath as we drift into the kitchens, halls, and fields of centuries past. Tonight's story unfolds in the flowing chapters, each one an invitation to rest within the past. The first light of dawn in the medieval countryside was gentle, never hurried. The sky would slowly turn from shades of grey to soft amber as the mist clung to the fields and meadows. You may imagine the distant crow of a rooster, a sound as old as time itself, carrying across the thatched rooftops of clustered cottages. Within these simple homes, life began with food, not in the sense of luxury, but in the sense of sustenance, nourishment to carry the body into a day of long, steady labor. For most people, breakfast was not the hearty feast we might know today. Instead, it was often a modest bite taken after morning prayers or chores. A peasant might break a coarse loaf of bread, heavy and dark from rye or barley, its crust hard, its flavor slightly sour. The bread was often dipped into ale low in alcohol, brewed to be safe to drink when water could not always be trusted. This ale was thin, more like liquid bread than strong drink, and it carried the earthy scent of barley malt. Sometimes a small piece of cheese, sharp and tangy, made its way onto the wooden table, or perhaps a little butter, yellow and soft in the summer months, harder and paler in the winter cold. Eggs were a gift of the hens, but not taken lightly, each one gathered from the straw-filled coop, warm and fragile in the palm of a child's hand. They might be boiled until firm or scrambled in the sizzling fat of pork. When such luxuries could be spared, the mornings moved quickly into labor, and food was the quiet rhythm beneath it all. In the fields, peasants bent their backs to the soil, guided by the turning of seasons in towns. Artisans opened their shops, the air filling with the smell of newly baked bread, of tanned leather, or of the smoky tang of a blacksmith's forge. By midday, hunger stirred again, and with it, the main meal of the day. This meal was the true centerpiece of daily eating, not just for peasants, but for nobles as well. A simple village family might gather around a large pot of pottage, a slow-cooked porridge oyster made from grains like oats, barley, or wheat, thickened with whatever vegetables were at hand. You may picture the pot simmering on the hearthstone, stirred now and then with a wooden ladle, as carrots, onions, and turnips softened in the broth. Sometimes a handful of beans or peas gave the pottage heartiness, and on better days, a sliver of salted pork or dried fish lent flavor. The taste was earthy, plain, yet comforting in its warmth. In noble households, the midday meal was altogether different, though still bound to the same rhythms of hunger and satisfaction. Imagine a long hall, its walls hung with tapestries, a fire blazing at the center, and long wooden tables set with trench-as-thick slices of bread used. As plates, servants carried in dishes of roasted meats, pheasants, or venison from the hunt. Platters gleamed with glazed pies filled with minced pork or beef, spiced with pepper, cinnamon, or saffron brought along distant trade routes. The wealth of the noble table lay not only in the quantity of food, but in the spices that transformed it, whispering of lands far beyond the horizon. The sounds of such a meal were gentle but steady, the murmur of voices, the clink of knives against wooden trenchers, the pouring of wine or ale into goblets. At times, a minstrel's soft tune filled the hall, weaving music with the meal. And yet, for all its grandeur, the noble feast was still tied to the same heartbeat as the peasantess pottage. The need to be nourished, to share bread, to pause in the day's long journey. As shadows lengthened and twilight approached, the final meal of the day came. For peasants, supper was a modest affair. Perhaps a small portion of the same pottage warmed again on the hearth, or a crust of bread dipped into broth. Some nights it was nothing more than a wedge of cheese, or a bowl of thin gruel. The day's labor had ended, and the meal was taken quietly, the fire casting flickering shadows on rough wooden walls. Children leaned against their parents, the warmth of the hearth lulling them into drowsiness. For the nobility, supper was lighter than the midday feast, but still abundant. Cold meats from earlier in the day might be served again, alongside delicate pastries or spiced fruits preserved with honey, roasted birds, partridge, quail, or small songbirds might be offered in gilded dishes. Sweetened wine, mulled with cinnamon or cloves, warmed the body against the chill of evening. Across both cottage and castle, the rhythm of meals echoed the rhythm of the day. Bread, the staff of life, appeared in every setting, whether dense and dark or soft and white. Ale was drunk in both humble mugs and noble goblets. Pottage, humble or refined, was a dish shared across the social spectrum. And above all, meals marked the passing of time itself, the quiet beginning of morning, the gathering pause of midday, and the restful close of evening. The night would descend slowly, with stars glimmering above the silent fields and the glow of hearth fires softening within homes. The people of the Middle Ages lived close to the earth, close to their food, and close to the steady beat of days and seasons. And as they drifted into sleep, their bodies nourished by bread, ale, and stew, they knew the morning would come again with roosters crowing, fires kindling, and another day beginning in the same ancient rhythm. When we think of food in the Middle Ages, it is tempting to imagine only great feasts and banquets, tables laden with roasted meats and glittering goblets of wine. And indeed, those meals existed, shimmering with spectacle and ritual. But the true story of medieval cuisine stretches far beyond. The banquet hall, winding its way through kitchens both grand and humble. It is a story carried in the smoke of hearth fires, in recipes passed from one pair of hands to another, and in the quiet rhythm of life itself. One of the most remarkable figures in this story was Guillaume Tyrrell, more commonly known by the name Taillevant. Born in France in the 14th century, Taillevant began his life with little to distinguish him. His childhood was likely spent in kitchens, performing humble tasks, fetching water, tending fires, grinding grains with steady hands. Yet over time, through patience and skill, he rose to become the chief cook of kings. His career spanned the reigns of Charles V and Charles VI of France, and through his craft, he shaped the very way noble dining was understood. Taillevant's life is remembered most vividly through his book, La Viandière, one of the earliest surviving cookbooks of medieval Europe. This book was more than a list of recipes, it was a reflection of the culinary world of its time. Within its pages, Taillevant recorded instructions for preparing meats, fish, sauces, and pastries, each dish crafted with careful attention to balance, texture, and flavor. Spices so precious in the medieval imagination were employed not merely for taste, but for symbolism and show. Dishes were painted with saffron to glow golden, sprinkled with sugar to gleam, or arranged in forms designed to delight the eye as much as the tongue. Imagine, if you will, one of Taillevant's banquets. A boar, roasted whole, its skin crackling, would be brought forth and placed upon a grand table. Swans might appear, redressed in their feathers, their wings spread as if in flight. Pies, golden crusted, might be sliced open to release doves that fluttered into the air. To the amazement of the gathered guests, wine flowed in generous measures, and musicians played soft melodies. To accompany the spectacle, to eat at such a feast was to witness theatre, each dish telling its own story of wealth, connection, and prestige. Yet even as Taillevant's recipes filled noble halls, another kind of culinary story unfolded quietly in the villages. Here, no books recorded the recipes, yet knowledge was passed faithfully from mother to daughter, from one generation to the next. A woman at her hearth did not measure spices with scales or count minutes with clocks. Instead, she knew by the weight of her hand, by the smell of the pot, by the look of the bubbling stew when it was ready. A recipe for pottage, simple as it was, lived in memory and practice rather than parchment. These two threads the grand and the humble ran together throughout the Middle Ages. While the noble feasts dazzled with their extravagance, the simpler meals held their own dignity. A freshly baked loaf, the scent filling a cottage with warmth, carried a comfort no less profound than a gilded pie in a king's hall. Both noble and peasant alike shared the truth. That food was central not only for survival, but for gathering, for community, for the rhythm of life itself. Beyond Taillevant, the story of medieval cuisine also includes the cooks, brewers, and bakers who lived in towns and cities in London, Paris, and Florence. Guilds regulated the preparation of bread, ale, and meat, Bakers were required to produce loaves of specific weights, their ovens glowing day and night. Alewives, often women, brewed small ale for everyday drinking, pouring it into mugs for neighbors who stopped at their doorsteps. These ordinary workers rarely found their names written in chronicles, yet they sustained the very heart of their communities. Even kings, with all their wealth, depended on the labor of countless unseen hands. Farmers grew the wheat, shepherds tended the flocks, fishermen cast their nets in rivers and seas. The nobility's feasts, with their shimmering spectacles, would not have existed without the quiet toil of villagers who never saw the inside of a palace. In this way, the story of medieval cuisine is not simply one of recipes or feasts, it is a story of connection, stretching from the humblest thatched cottage to the grandest stone hall. And woven through it all was faith. Meals were often blessed before eating, with prayers murmured as hands folded. Food was seen as a gift, a daily reminder of providence and divine order. The abundance of a harvest was cause for thanksgiving, while scarcity and famine reminded communities of their fragility. In both joy and hardship, food carried meaning far beyond nourishment. So, the story of medieval cuisine is both splendid and simple. It is Tailvant's viandier and a nameless woman's pottage. It is the glitter of saffron and the earthiness of rye bread. It is theatre and survival, ceremony and comfort. And as we let the past drift softly through our thoughts, we may see that the meals of long ago, though shaped by different times, echo the same truth we know today, that food is the quiet rhythm of life, shared by all who gather at a table. In the medieval world, food was never just food. Each loaf of bread, each sip of ale, each roasted bird or simmering pot of pottage carried meanings that went beyond nourishment. Meals were shaped not only by what the land provided, but by faith, by custom, by belief. To eat was not merely to fill the body, it was to align oneself with seasons, with health, and with the order of the divine. The church, ever present in medieval life, cast a long shadow over the rhythms of eating. The calendar was filled with days of fasting, days when meat was forbidden, when the diet turned to fish, beans, bread, and vegetables. In some years, nearly half the days might be fast days. To modern ears, this may sound like deprivation, but for medieval people, it was a form of devotion, a way of disciplining the body in service of the spirit. The smell of fish markets on the eve of Lent, the bustle of households preparing stews without meat, the quiet murmurs of prayer before meals, all were reminders that food connected body and soul. Fish, in particular, carried deep symbolism. It was associated with Christ, with purity, and with spiritual renewal. Barrels of salted herring arrived in towns, their briny scent filling the air. River fish trout, eels, and carp were prized as well, caught in woven nets or traps along winding banks. Monasteries often maintained fish ponds, serene stretches of water reflecting the sky, filled with carp and pike to provide sustenance during long stretches of fasting. Beyond faith, there was the old framework of the fehumers, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine. Medieval physicians taught that the human body was guided by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each food, it was believed, carried qualities that could affect the balance of these humors. Some foods were considered hot, others cold, some moist, others dry. To eat well was to keep the body in harmony. Imagine a physician advising his patient: roasted meats were warming, suited for the cold of winter. Cucumbers and melons were cooling, better for the heat of summer. Spices, ginger, pepper, cinnamon were thought to stimulate warmth and vigor, while dairy, heavy and moist, might weigh the body down if taken in excess. Even the simplest meal was not free from such considerations. It was believed that every bite influenced health and mood. Then there were the mysteries of spices themselves. Arriving along the vast trade routes from Asia, they were treasured not only for flavor, but for the sense of wonder they inspired. A pinch of saffron, golden and fragrant, was worth its weight in silver. Cloves, with their sharp, sweet aroma, might be stored carefully in small wooden boxes. Nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper, these were not everyday flavors for most people, but rare touches of the exotic, carrying with them a sense of power and protection. To the wealthy, they were symbols of prestige. To the common imagination, they were mysterious, almost magical, gifts from far-off lands. Salt, too, held its own aura of importance. It was not just a seasoning, but a preservative, a way to hold back the decay of time. To share salt at a table carried meaning. In noble halls, the great salt cellar sat at the center of the table, a gleaming vessel of silver or carved wood. Where one sat in relation to it mattered greatly. Those above the salt were of higher rank, those below the salt of lower status. Something as simple as salt thus became a marker of order, of honor, of belonging. Food was also tied to superstition and local custom. Bread, for example, was believed to hold protective powers. Some would make the sign of the cross over a loaf before cutting it, a blessing for both the food and the eater. Certain herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, were thought to strengthen the body or guard against evil. A cup of warm spiced wine might be drunk not only for comfort, but to ward off sickness. During the chill of winter, feasts, too, carried their own rituals. The washing of hands before meals was not only practical but symbolic, a cleansing before partaking in the gift of food. Meals often began with a blessing and ended with a prayer, bookending the act of eating with gratitude. In monasteries, silence often accompanied meals, with scriptures read aloud, to remind the monks that food nourished the spirit as much as the body. And when famine came, as it sometimes did, silence deepened. Empty fields, failed harvests, and the absence of bread carried not just hunger but a spiritual weight, a reminder of human dependence on divine providence. "Give us this day our daily bread" was not an empty phrase but a heartfelt plea, echoing in every household, every church, every whispered prayer. Archaeology today still uncovers these mysteries. Charred grains in hearth remains tell us what was cooked. Tiny glass jars hint at the spices treasured in noble households. Bones of fish and fowl whisper of meals both simple and grand. Each fragment carries the quiet memory of belief, the reminder that food in the Middle Ages was as much about meaning as about survival. And so, when we picture a medieval meal, we must see not only the bread and the stew, not only the roast and the wine, but the layers of faith and mystery that shaped each bite. Food was a ritual, a remedy, a symbol, a prayer. It nourished the body, yes, but it also spoke to the soul. When we think of medieval life, it is easy to imagine kings and queens feasting in candlelit halls, while peasants sit by their hearth with little more than bread and broth. The truth, as always, is more nuanced. Food was a language of class, a quiet yet unmistakable marker of where one stood in society. From the gilded tables of the nobility to the humble wooden bowls of laborers, cuisine revealed not only wealth but culture, values, and even faith. And yet, across these divisions, the rhythm of meals, morning bread, midday sustenance, evening supper formed a thread of commonality that bound medieval people together. Let us begin, softly, in the great halls of the nobility. You may imagine a vast stone chamber, high ceilings arched like the vault of a cathedral, with long tables stretching into the distance. The walls are draped with colorful tapestries to keep away the chill, while torches and candles bathe the hall in a flickering golden glow. At the high table, where the lord and lady sit, the platters are heavy with delicacies. Roasted venison, swan in rich sauces, gilded pastries filled with almond paste, and dishes tinted with saffron and cinnamon from faraway lands. The fragrance of spiced wine fills the air. Eating here is not simply nourishment, it is performance. Courses arrive with ceremony, music may play, and servants move quietly, attending to every detail. Meals among the nobility were not just about taste, they were symbols of power. To serve a rare spice was to show influence in distant trade. To present a whole roasted peacock, its feathers reassembled in display, was to demonstrate wealth and artistry. Even the order of courses followed: a coat, soups and stews first, then roasts, followed by sweets and fruit. The highborn might eat from fine pewter or even silver dishes, while drinking from goblets of glass, a rarity in itself. And yet, for all this opulence, the daily rhythm remained. Bread was still the foundation. Broth was still poured, and hunger still returned with each passing day. Now let us turn gently to the countryside, where peasants lived by the work of their hands. The setting could not be more different. Picture a small timber cottage with a thatched roof, the air inside thick with the smoke of a central hearth. Meals were simple, shaped by the seasons and the toil of the fields. Here, bread was darker, made of barley, rye, or oats, for wheat was costly and scarce. A pot might bubble with pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, flavored perhaps with a scrap of bacon or a bone when fortune allowed. On ordinary days, onions, leeks, cabbage, and peas would fill the bowl, seasoned with herbs grown just outside the door. Milk, cheese, and eggs provided sustenance when available, and in autumn, apples and pears were gathered from orchards to store for the cold months ahead. For peasants, food was rarely abundant, yet it was cherished. Each loaf of bread was the result of labor in the fields, sowing and reaping, threshing and grinding, kneading and baking. Every bite carried the rhythm of the seasons, and while there might not be gilded feasts, there was community neighbors gathered to share what they had, children learning the taste of honey only on festival days, and the hush of gratitude that followed each simple meal. Between these two worlds lay many others. In towns, merchants and artisans lived lives shaped by trade and craft. Their tables were modest, yet often more varied than those of peasants. A successful merchant might afford wheat bread more often, or salted fish from distant coasts. Markets offered olives, figs, and spices brought from afar, though only in small amounts. Inns served hearty meals of meat pies and ale to travelers, bringing a mix of flavors into bustling urban life. In monasteries, meanwhile, meals were governed by discipline and faith. Monks and nuns ate in silence, listening to sacred readings. Their meals plain but steady: vegetables, legumes, bread, and on certain days, fish. For them, food was not luxury but order, a rhythm tied to devotion, and yet, despite these differences, certain customs united medieval people across class and place. Fasting days, for example, were observed by rich and poor alike. On such days, meat was forbidden, and so fish, dairy, or vegetables became the shared fare of all. Festivals and holy days, too, brought moments of shared abundance. At Christmas, even the poor might receive gifts of food, a little more than usual to mark the joy of the season. At harvest time, celebrations filled with bread, ale, and roasted meats reminded all of the shared cycle of the earth's bounty. Consider also the act of hospitality, so central to medieval life. To offer food to a guest was a duty and an honor, whether one was a lord in a castle or a farmer in a cottage. The guest might be offered a gilded plate of venison or simply a rough slice of bread with cheese, yet in both cases the meaning was the same: welcome, community, the breaking of bread as a bridge between souls. As the day drew to its close, the difference in meals became most visible once again. In castles, the evening might bring a light supper, perhaps cold meats and sweetened wine, before the nobles withdrew to their chambers. In cottages, the hearth would glow with the last pot of stew, and families would share what remained before sleep. And in monasteries, the bell would toll, calling all to quiet rest after the final meal. The contrast between rich and poor, town and country, lay plain in what they ate. And yet, beneath the layers of spice and scarcity, silver goblets and wooden bowls, there was a deeper commonality. Food sustained them all through long winters, through harvests, through holy days and quiet nights. Bread, in its many forms, united every table. The rhythm of meals marked the rhythm of life itself. Perhaps, as you imagine these worlds, you can sense both the difference and the connection. A noble's banquet filled with shimmering lights and a peasant's hearth warm with smoke may seem distant from each other, yet both were bound to the same turning of the seasons, the same need for nourishment, the same pause for gratitude before the next day's labor began. And so, in the quiet reflection of medieval cuisine, we see not only class and culture, but the shared humanity of those who lived long ago. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 5, another one? The world of food in the Middle Ages was never just about nourishment. It was tied to belief, to mystery, to symbolism. Every bite, every loaf, every cup of drink carried with it not only flavor, but meaning. For people of that time, the table was not separate from the sacred, nor from the unseen. And so, as we turn slowly into this chapter, let us drift into the subtle world of food as a language of faith, of magic, and of wonder. When you imagine the medieval person lifting bread to their lips, you may picture not just a simple act of eating, but something almost ceremonial. Bread was blessed often before every meal. The sign of the cross was traced upon it. as though to remind those gathered that this humble loaf was more than flour and water. It was a symbol of divine provision. In monasteries, silence was held at meals, the only sound being the scrape of wooden spoons and the whisper of prayer. For those monks, food was a form of worship measured, modest, and filled with gratitude. In the towns and villages, food also carried deep layers of meaning. Honey, golden and thick, was believed to have healing powers to preserve not only the body, but also the soul. It was used in medicines, in charms, and sometimes even in sacred rituals. The sweetness was thought to be a gift of heaven, carried by bees that themselves held symbolic power, admired for their order and tireless work. They were also mysteries woven into the rhythm of the seasons. The first harvest of grain each year was celebrated not only as food security, but also as a sacred offering. Bundles of wheat were decorated, lifted high in fields, and sometimes left in small corners as gifts to unseen spirits of fertility and abundance. The harvest bread was often baked in special shapes, circles, crosses, or even human-like forms, an echo of ancient beliefs that food itself was a bridge between the human world and the divine. And of course, fasting was as much a part of eating as feasting. To deny food was seen as a way to cleanse, to humble, to open oneself to God. Entire months of the calendar were governed by these rhythms: Lent, Advent, vigils before holy days. Fish replaced meat on countless tables, not merely because of scarcity, but because the church taught restraint. Fish carried symbolism to it, was linked to Christ himself, a sign of simplicity and purity. So, when medieval families sat with salted herring or a bowl of river pike, it was not just about sustenance, it was about living inside a sacred rhythm of time. But not all food beliefs were so solemn. There were whispers of magic in kitchens and cottages. Garlic was hung in doorways not only to flavor stews, but to keep away spirits of harm. Herbs were dried and bundled, believed to heal sickness or grant protection. Rosemary was tucked into pockets for memory, sage was brewed into teas for wisdom, and mint was placed near beds to calm troubled dreams. These were not merely ingredients, they were small mysteries woven into everyday life, and there were foods thought to carry omens. A crooked loaf of bread might suggest ill fortune. A spilled salt dish was cause for worry unless a pinch was quickly tossed over the shoulder to ward off bad luck. The simple act of dining carried these layers of watchfulness, as though every flavor had a shadow of meaning hidden behind it. At great feasts, food became almost theatrical in its symbolism. Peacocks were roasted and then dressed again in their shimmering feathers, a dazzling display of beauty, a reminder of pride and immortality. Swans, served on golden platters, suggested purity and grace. Even simple foods could carry meaning: apples recalling paradise, grapes recalling the vine of faith, pomegranates evoking mystery and abundance. At Christmas, spiced cakes carried the warmth of hope in winter. At Easter, eggs symbolized life returning with the spring. The turning of the year was marked not only with candles and bells, but with flavors, scents, and recipes that reached deep into the imagination. Mystery also lingered in the way medieval doctors and scholars described food. They believed every dish carried humors, qualities of heat, cold, wetness, or dryness. A balance of these humors was thought to shape health. A pear was cooling, ginger was warming, bread was steadying, wine was enlivening. Meals were chosen not only for appetite, but for harmony within the body, a gentle echo of the universe itself. Eating was seen as aligning oneself with the balance of nature. And so, in the quiet halls of scholars and in the bustling kitchens of townsfolk, food was never just food. It was medicine, it was ritual, it was story. To eat was to participate in the mysteries of the world. You may imagine now the candlelit room of a medieval family. The shadows flicker gently upon the walls. On the table rests a small loaf, perhaps some cheese, perhaps a dish of beans or a salted fish. Before anyone takes a bite, a prayer is spoken softly. The children listen, the parents bow their heads, and in that hush, the food seems to glow with a meaning beyond itself. This, then, is the world of medieval cuisine, not only as nourishment, but as mystery. Thus, every meal was more than flavor and fullness. It was a weaving together of faith, superstition, and wonder. A plate of food could tell a story, or hold a blessing, or carry an omen. And across the centuries, those small beliefs remind us that eating has always been more than survival it has been a way to. Touch something unseen, something larger, something eternal. As we reach the close of our journey into medieval cuisine, it becomes clear that food was never just about nourishment. In the Middle Ages, eating was a language of its own, a language of faith, of hierarchy, of celebration, and of survival. To understand medieval food is to understand medieval life itself, with all its contradictions of scarcity and abundance, humility and extravagance, devotion and indulgence. Let us begin with the grand feasts. Imagine yourself in a great hall, lit by flickering torches. Long wooden tables stretch the length of the room, covered with fresh herbs that serve as a natural tablecloth. The air hums with conversation, laughter, and the sound of minstrels playing lutes and flutes. On the days, the lord and lady sit slightly elevated, a visible reminder of their authority. The meal begins not with food, but with ceremony. Hands are washed in rose water. A blessing is spoken, and only then does the procession of dishes begin. Course after course is brought forth, not all at once, but in carefully arranged stages. First might come spiced wines and light appetizers, candied fruits, roasted nuts, or savory pastries filled with cheese and herbs. Then, the heavier courses arrive. Great roasts of venison or boar, glazed with honey and studded with cloves, are carried in with dramatic flair. Sometimes, elaborate dishes were designed purely to astonish, pies from which live birds would fly out when cut, or sugar sculpture shaped into castles, saints, or mythical beasts. But these feasts were more than indulgence. They were political theatre. Each guest's place at the table reflected their rank. What dishes you received and in what portion quietly reinforced the social order. Sharing food, too, was symbolic. A lord carving meat for his favored vassal could signal trust and loyalty. A banquet was as much about who ate where, and with whom, as it was about the food itself. In stark contrast stood the practice of fasting. Medieval Europe was deeply Christian, and the church imposed strict dietary rules. On Fridays, during Lent, and on the eve of certain feast days, meat was forbidden. For ordinary people, this meant turning to fish, eggs, cheese, and grains in coastal towns. Herring and cod became staples, salted or dried to last the season. Inland, pike, trout, and eels filled the gap. For the wealthy, fasting days became a chance to showcase creativity. Skilled cooks transformed fish into dishes that looked and tasted like meat, or served almond milk and rice prepared with saffron to mimic dairy and butter. These fasting rules were not simply restrictions. They carried profound spiritual meaning. To abstain from meat was to discipline the body, to remind oneself of humility, and to create space for reflection. Yet, as often happens, human ingenuity found ways to make even fasting elaborate. A Lenten table in a noble household could be as dazzling, in its own way, as a feast day banquet. Between feasting and fasting lay the everyday meals of common folk. Here, food was rarely about ceremony, it was about survival. A bowl of pottage simmered with whatever vegetables and grains were available might serve as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Bread, often coarse and dark, was a constant companion. Cheese, onions, and ale made appearances when possible. For peasants, meals were eaten communally, often from shared bowls with wooden spoons or simply hands. Though humble, these meals were also occasions for community. Sitting together at the hearth, sharing what little there was, created bonds of kinship and resilience. Food also carried symbolic weight in religious rituals. At weddings, the breaking of bread signified the joining of two families. At funerals, loaves and ale were distributed to mourners and the poor, a final act of charity on behalf of the departed. On holy days, special foods like spiced cakes or blessed breads reminded the faithful of the sacred woven into the fabric of daily life. Even in monasteries, where simplicity was prized, meals were structured around prayer. The bell would ring, monks would gather in silence, and as they ate plain fare vegetables, bread, perhaps fish, one brother would read aloud from scripture or the writings of saints. Eating became an extension of devotion. Seasonality, too, gave rhythm to medieval eating. Spring brought fresh greens like nettles, leeks, and parsley. Long awaited after winter's barrenness, Summer meant abundance berries, cherries, peas, and beans. Autumn was the season of harvest and slaughter, when grain was stored, apples pressed into cider, and animals killed for meat to be salted or smoked. Winter demanded resourcefulness, dried beans, root vegetables, salted pork, and hard cheeses sustained families until the cycle began again. To eat was to live in harmony with the land's rhythms, a relationship modern times often forget. Perhaps most striking is how deeply communal medieval eating was. Rarely did people dine alone. Meals brought households, neighbors, or even entire villages together. Even silence, such as in a monastery, was shared silence. Food was both necessity and glue, binding people to one another. As we reflect on this, it is easy to see how food shaped not only bodies but also culture, belief, and identity. To the medieval mind, eating was never trivial. It was a way to honor God, to affirm social order, to celebrate, and to endure. Every loaf of bread, every sip of ale, every grand banquet or humble bowl of pottage carried meaning. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself in those medieval halls and cottages. Picture the firelight dancing on wooden beams, the aroma of bread and broth filling the air, the murmur of voices sharing stories at the table. In this world, food was more than fuel, it was the heartbeat of daily life. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you may carry with you a little of that medieval sense of gratitude for the meals that sustain us, and for the company with whom we share them. As we draw the curtains on our journey through the kitchens, markets, and banquet halls of the medieval world, we are left with a picture both simple and profound. Food in the Middle Ages was never merely about nourishment. It was the thread that wove together faith, community, survival, and celebration. From the humble peasants who tilled the soil and ate their daily bread, to the nobility who displayed their wealth in glittering feasts of roasted meats and spiced wines, each table told a story. In those times, a loaf of bread was more than a meal, it was the heart of sustenance. A feast was not simply a gathering, but a performance of loyalty, prestige, and joy. Fasting days were not just dietary rules, but expressions of faith and discipline. The ingredients barley, rye, honey, leeks, salted herring, venison, and cinnamon painted a palate as rich and varied as the society that consumed them. The medieval world teaches us that food carried meaning beyond flavor. It reflected class divisions, religious devotion, and human ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Cooking, preserving, and sharing meals were acts that bound communities together, and every bite held a reminder of the cycles of nature, faith, and social life. Tonight, as you let your thoughts drift gently toward rest, imagine once more the flicker of torchlight across a long wooden table. Hear the laughter of peasants sharing a rustic stew. Picture the glittering halls of nobility, where spiced dishes and delicate pastries were presented with ceremony. Feel the rhythm of fasting and feasting, of hunger and abundance, of ordinary days and extraordinary celebrations. The medieval world, in all its complexity, whispers to us through its flavors, reminding us that food is history, memory, and connection. As you close your eyes, carry with you this simple truth: though centuries separate us, the act of eating, of gathering to share bread and warmth remains timeless. Rest now, with the taste of the Middle Ages lingering softly in your imagination. May these images comfort you, ease your mind, and guide you gently into sleep.